welcome to the Product Science Podcast, where we're helping startup founders and product leaders build high-growth products, teams, and companies through real conversations with people who have tried it and aren't afraid to share lessons learned from their failures along the way. I'm your host, Holly Hester Riley, founder and CEO of H2R Product Science. This week on the Product Science Podcast, I'm excited to share a conversation with Andrew Michael. Andrew is an entrepreneur with 14 years of experience in digital growth companies as a founder or senior manager with a focus on customer retention, data analytics, product, and growth. Welcome, Andrew.
Thanks very much for having me, Holly. It's great to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you. So you have a pretty interesting background. It sounds like you've been a part of several startups and you're leading one right now. I'd love to hear a little bit about your journey. What got you into startups in the first place?
What got me into startups in the first place? It's a good one. I haven't actually thought about the specifics behind it, but I think for myself, I've always had that entrepreneurial itch growing up, just even in school. And I came from like a family of entrepreneurs as well. I think it was ingrained in me. I think the first business I started was just like selling sweets and ice creams at the school until the school shut it down because the school shop wasn't doing as well as it normally did. I think that was like always in my nature, was to start businesses. And then I actually, at school, was lucky, fortunate to go to a school where we were taught to program at an early age and got into that side of things. And then actually moved. I grew up in South Africa. I moved to Cyprus and I did a whole bunch of different jobs. If I tell you, I tried everything and anything, like from digging, like driving a digger to dig holes for the electricity company, to pool boy, to barman, literally everything. And then just decided one day, wait, I have this really good skill that I used to have. Like, why not pick that up again and see what you can do with it and see make useful? And then just really fell in love with it again and started from there, just trying out different things and tinkering to where we are today.
Sounds like you're a doer through and through.
Yes, I'd say that.
Yeah. What was your first experience inside a tech startup?
Yeah, so the first startup like I built for myself was actually a company called Megamall Cyprus. It was a tech company, and this was like quite a long time ago now, 10 to 12 years ago. And the initial premise was like we saw everything was slowly starting to move online more and more. And I thought, okay, it was only natural that online shopping was going to become a bigger thing and people would want to be able to start selling products online. So Megamall Cyprus was an attempt to essentially what Shopify or others have become today, is to allow people to be able to create their own online store in a matter of minutes, to accept payments and start selling their products, which is what we did. But I think back then I was still very young, very naive. And I felt that like Cyprus was a good enough market to focus on when in retrospect, like you cannot build any business of substance in a place this small. Like it's a good testing ground to figure things out, but you really need to be thinking globally from the start. Yeah, that was the first deep dive into it and a lot of really valuable lessons learned along the way.
What were some of those lessons?
I think one of the early ones was really like how critical the team is. It's like I had been told these bad stories around like having partners and how that was a negative experience for certain individuals. And I think these issues that were like fed to me maybe don't really apply as much in the startup world. If I see in retrospect now the differences in that. And then that sort of led me to think, okay, I don't need anybody else. I'm going to do this by myself. I'm going to just hire people where I can or work with consultants here and there. But ultimately, if you're not really surrounded by a really strong team that cares deeply about the product or the problem that you're solving, you never really get any good pushback from anybody. So you can end up going down the wrong route very easily, very fast. You run out of steam, I think, at some point as well, when you don't really have that good backing and real energy from the rest of the team as well. So there was a whole bunch of things like this that just led me to say, okay, first of all, there's no ways you can really build a good company without the right people around you. And the notion that there's issues with partnerships and things like that, I think that whatever you do, you can always find issues and things. But if you like spend the time to get to know and understand the people you're going to be working with, those can lead to some of the best relationships. And actually, follow on startup, my two closest friends now were ex-co-founders. One of them christened my son, and the other one was the best man at my wedding. And like we're still really great friends today, even though we don't work together anymore. So I think proved that fallacy false, like they're around partnerships. And I think that came from more traditional business. And yeah, I think that was a big lesson.
Oh, that's interesting. So what was that next startup that you just mentioned?
Yeah, so the next startup we started actually, like, again, this was probably not a great way to start a startup, but I was working with the previous co-founder and we had a startup live weekend in Cyprus. It was like one of the first things. And we decided, okay, let's go and check it out. Let's see what's all about and what's happening. And called up another friend of mine who had previously worked together. We said, let's go together. Like, you need teams for this. So let's figure it out when we're there, what we're going to do. And we had no idea what we really wanted to do over the weekend, but it was actually just a game on the Friday night. It said pick 3 words and come up with an idea. And we did that. We pitched it. Everybody loved the idea, and we decided, okay, let's try build this. And like a month later, we had all quit our jobs. We were on our way to Copenhagen because we got accepted to Startup Bootcamp, which is like one of the good accelerator programs within Europe at the time. And that was really, it was called Funify. And the idea behind it was to gamify chores for kids. So to make it a game out of it. In retrospect, like none of us were parents, so we didn't really understand the problem clearly. We just fell into sort of this emotion. I think once we had gone deep down the rabbit hole of like literally quitting our jobs, and me and my co-founder had probably some of the best jobs you could have at our age on the island at that point in time. And we were heavily invested there. I think like knowing and understanding the problem space and the problem itself, it was a big challenge when you can't really empathize and relate. I think you can do a lot of user research and understand the problems and pain points and work towards it, but I think you definitely have an edge when you build for yourself and you are the customer, and we definitely weren't the customer at that stage.
Interesting. I guess I would challenge the idea that you have an edge when you are one of the customers, but I guess it depends a bit on what kind of research you were able to do and how you explored the problem space, or if you did enough of that in the beginning.
Yeah.
What do you think about that when you look back on it?
So we definitely didn't do enough research in the beginning in terms of the problem space. And I think like one of the biggest learnings was just that we had an issue with the product when it came to graduation churn, in the sense that our product did a good job, but that job shelf life was very finite. So once your users had started to use the product, they started to see good results, there was no longer a need for the product because it had to solve the problem that they came to originally. And this was like, we're trying to build a subscription business off the back of this. So I think that's something we probably could have picked up a lot earlier from research itself. But yeah, I think like the edge, when I say the edge, I agree with you. You can do a lot of good research and you can still build product. But I think just being able to empathize a little bit better with users and like feeling that pain a little bit yourself, it's hard to beat that direct experience and that direct knowledge. It does come with its drawbacks of like really bad cognitive biases and you thinking you understand the problem better than you do. So you can't trade one for the other. But I think just having both together is a big help.
So what ended up happening with that startup?
Yeah, so that company, we ended up to about 100,000 users. We did some really good partnerships with Lego and with Unilever. We ended up getting acquired by a Danish company that we were working with at the time.
Okay.
Not much happened from that company, but out of there, we actually launched a new company. We just happened to randomly be a hack on one weekend. We were like trying to see how to drive traffic and actually nothing related to the product, but we ended up launching a new company which was called AdJelly, which is the essential like notion was to make Facebook ads stupidly simple. So this was still 6-7 years ago when Facebook was still a little bit complicated for most small businesses to be able to create ads on their platform. And we ended up as well building what was called the ad size guide, which essentially back then as well, it was very difficult to understand the different ad sizes. Things were changing on a weekly basis, like to get the right templates and so forth. We built that in like the space of a weekend, that first version like of just the ad sizes. And I think on the Monday or Tuesday, we had over 10,000 visitors to the site and started generating some serious traffic to it. And from that business as well, we ended up getting acquired by a company called Brandzuka, which is the fastest growing ad network for video ads, for like TV ads in the US. And at that time, then I think we'd gone off like a run of 5-6 years of full in startup mode, startup life, like traveling around the world, sleeping on mattresses at some point, going all in. I decided as well then, David Dominant, the CEO of Hotjar, if you're familiar with Hotjar Analytics and Feedback, he was an advisor at the time and he said, okay, why not come to Hotjar, see how things are being done, and when you're ready, you can get started again. So I was lucky, had a SaaS masterclass there, like over 3.5 years. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So what did you do at Hotjar?
Yeah, so Hotjar was very lucky in the sense that when I joined, like with the entrepreneurial background, I had a lot of freedom and flexibility as well to work on different aspects of the business. I joined in marketing, but pretty much I think whenever I saw a problem and I suggested a plan for the problem and how we would go about doing it, it was almost always, yes, like go ahead and let's get this done. Like through the time, I got to work on some really interesting projects. I worked a lot on the go-to-market strategy of the business in the early days, did a lot of the pricing and packaging research for the company, of which like the end result ended up in a 30% increase in ASP from that initial research and studies, along with a few other good product managers.
Can you tell me more about that before you move on?
Yeah, of course. So in the early days, Hotjar essentially was charging a flat fee. We had a $29 plan, we had an $89 plan. And the idea was that like as traffic scaled, the pricing should scale, which it never in the beginning. We never really enforced it, which was one aspect. But we did quite a lengthy study. We worked with an outside partner as well, Price Intelligently. to conduct the research itself. And basically the research is broken up into different phases, which is first you dive deeply into really trying to understand who the buyer personas are. And we typically start with a panel study in these studies. And the reason for that is that the customers that you have today are a direct reflection of the product that you've built and the marketing you've done up until now. They may not necessarily be the best reflection, and you cannot really get good pricing data and research from customers. Like, how much are you willing to pay for a product or service? Like, they already know what they're paying, and that's what they're willing to pay in their mind. So you're already set. So I think like with the pricing and packaging research, it's done over a series of different panel studies, really trying to understand, okay, what are users' willingness to pay? How likely are they to buy? And they also tend to be very useful then to understand, like for your packaging, what features go into different packages and things like this.
Tell me more about what you mean by a panel study.
So a panel study, what you do is there's different providers. So myself as well, I did consulting for pricing and packaging for a few other companies, and we use a company like Cint. So Cint, essentially what they allow you to do is find a specific profile that fits who your target buyer is. So you can set like the demographics, what their role is, income, company size, and that essentially allows you to reach that audience for the study. And if for this specific one, you'd aim for 500 to 600 respondents for these surveys per study. And essentially, the panel is just like being able to meet and reach people that match your criteria.
So what was the mix when you were doing that pricing and packaging research? What was the mix of one-on-one interviews versus surveys versus other forms of gathering data?
Yeah. So there was quite a bit different. So like the work we did with pricing today was just purely panel study, but ourselves internally as well, we looked at a few other aspects. And the first aspect that we started actually with was some retention analysis, just trying to look at data and see, okay, what makes our most successful customers? At the time, what we did was we took a cohort of users who had been paying us for longer than 12 months, that were spending over a certain amount, and that also showed some good levels of engagement within the product. So it wasn't just about paying us, but also making sure that they were actively using it. And we took that cohort, then we enriched the data. So there's services like Clearbit that allow you to run through domains and run through email addresses, and they give you back firmographic and demographic properties about the end user. And then from that, what we were able to do was take those properties and then map them back to retention itself to see, okay, was there any specific firmographic or demographic properties about these users that stood out to be more likely to be a healthy retained customer versus not. So that was the first aspect. So that gave us a good indication roughly of who and what size of company or the age of the company or the roles that this person had was most likely to have would be good customer fits. And then we also then took another viewpoint of it and sort, okay, like recently acquired customers. So we also wanted to see, okay, what is the demographic and firmographic makeup of those that are resonating with the messaging that we're putting out in the world today? Because obviously the longest retained customers, there was some bias in there as well from the early days and membership bias as well. So we wanted to understand that. And again, similar process with Clearbit, just looking at those properties and then identifying good forms. And then the other one as well is trying to understand the conversion rates of the various properties. So we took a cohort of users that signed up 6 months previously. Hotjar was a freemium product at the time, or still is. And we wanted to see, like, over time, how many of the different of that cohort converted and what was their demographic makeup. Because the same thing applies as well, is that we may have been like acquiring a lot of a specific segment, but not converting them as well. Or we may have not been acquiring that many of a specific segment, but the conversion rates were insanely high. So we wanted to understand, okay, like maybe marketing could do a better job then of acquiring that specific segment and acquiring less of the other. So that was the third component from a data perspective. And this was purely like from an analytics perspective, just going through quantitatively, looking at the different properties and then mapping those out on various different graphs so we could see. And we actually ended up coming up with a good scoring model as well out of this in the early days, which allowed us to then see, okay, a really good correlation between the higher the score was, the more likely they were to retain, and the higher the net MRR retention, net MRR revenue, like everything trended nicely with that based on the scoring model that we produced. And it was a really simple model in its own right. So
what were some of the actual concrete things that you found in terms of what was maybe a customer profile that fit one of those stories that you just told, like either you didn't have a lot but they converted really well or vice versa?
Yeah, so one of the first, I think, lessons in this, like the scoring model and what is like an ideal customer profile, I think, is not have this idea like it's a specific thing. So it's not like saying, okay, it's a company of 100 to 200 people that have this many users in this industry and this spec. That's ideal customer profile. I think that's a very narrow view on the world, and you end up missing out on a lot of opportunity. Because if a company like has 2 or 3 properties, they can still be a really good fit company if they don't meet all the criteria. So there's just like a degrees to how much of a good fit they are. So that was one of the first learnings from that perspective. The second thing we learned as well, and it's something actually been phased out now, but Alexa rank was one of the biggest indicators of indication of whether a company would be successful using the product or not, and if they'd be retained longest.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and the reason for that is Alexa rank is a good indicator of traffic. So it seems quite logical that the sites with the highest traffic would have the most interest in using a service to improve their experience. But I've also seen this translate in other companies that I've since helped with pricing and packaging, where they're helping a Shopify store, and Shopify also give a rank, I believe it is, to the stores themselves. So just like Alexa rank, you get a Shopify rank, a Shopify score, which is how much traffic or how busy the store is itself. And that also ended up being like one of the biggest indicators of a good fit for the business and for the customer. And yeah, there was a lot of areas where we looked into, like company size made a difference, company age made a difference, the role of the end user made a difference. So we saw like product managers, if they were the ones who set up the accounts initially, were a lot more likely to be sticky and roll that out. So there was a lot of these individual properties, but you can't say it was like a group of 5-6 properties. There was a clear outright winner. It was more just, okay, when you look at just the different roles, we could see, okay, there was 2 or 3 outliers compared to all the other roles. When you look at the company sizes, there's 2 or 3 compared to all the others. And then from that, it's like how you develop the scoring model and say, okay, if they're one of these 2 or 3, it's a 3 points. If they one of the next best 2 or 3, it's a 2 point. And that's how we just developed like a very rudimentary system, but it ended up working really, really well.
And what did you do with the information? Like when a potential client had a good score, how did that change their experience or how you spoke to them?
Yeah, so it didn't change the experience that much or how we spoke to them, but what we were starting to do was look at ways from a customer success, from a support standpoint and from a sales standpoint. So sales was probably the first to implement it and start to work with the score. And really what it allowed them to do was to prioritize their leads, because I think Hotjar had a really high volume of inbound leads, and there was just never going to be enough time for sales team to be able to go through everything. So the first step was just really how could we enable them to prioritize a lot better. We rolled that out with the sales team and then started using their feedback from them to iterate on the model itself and trying to understand, okay, are these good fits? Are there certain properties from there? So sales was the first. And then the next one, which is a little bit, I think, time of leaving and stuff, was going to be around like support. But ultimately, I think Hotjar also had a really great philosophy around support, and that's like support should be equal and fair and great for everybody. So I think that was less likely to be adopted. And then the next one was in marketing as well. So you could slowly start to see, okay, different campaigns that were bringing in, what was the score from the different campaigns, what was the lead quality that marketing was bringing through the door, what improvements could be made, are there specific campaigns or channels that tend to bring in higher scoring leads.
Yeah. And how did this work that you were doing contribute towards the startup that you run today? Because it sounds like there's some connection.
Yes, there is a connection in some way. So the startup I'm doing today, it started actually out at Hotjar. And as I mentioned, like I'd been working on a lot of different research for the team. So at some point as well, focused like on the ICP, on pricing and packaging, churn research. And I set up the business intelligence team at Hotjar. So we're an analytics and feedback company, which is a little bit ironic. We started setting up really good data stack quite late into the setup. Although we did have a good setup in the beginning, the team really didn't rely much on it because it ended up getting polluted. It was messy. So Hotjar actually in the early days was like heavily driven by qualitative feedback and like founder intuition and things like that. And I think it makes a lot of sense. And in retrospect, is something that I think actually is the only way in the early stage, because you don't have the luxury of the data to give you good signals at an early stage. So an early stage, like you're getting more noise than signal from data. Like the focus should be on just speaking to customers continuously and really trying to dig into the pain points and understanding. But then you do hit a certain size and scale when like you absolutely need to have data. So that happened. We set up the team, and actually it was one quarter, company was using OKRs and we had started planning. And even though the whole company had the same objectives, everybody was doing a little bit of their own research and going off into their own different directions. And I noticed that one of the product teams did an amazing job where they brought all the research together. They brought some customer feedback together. They had some data and analytics, and they created a space in Confluence. And they were like, okay, this is how we're going to go and act these objectives, and these are the solutions and so forth. But that information pretty much died there on that Confluence page, and nobody in the rest of the company saw it, even though the insights that they had would have been valuable for customer success, for sales, for marketing. And I just said, okay, like, why we need to fix this. And part of it as well was that in business intelligence, we had done some really great studies that research had been repeated by the product team. They managed to get it on their own and bring it into certain places, but it was clearly like a waste of time and resources as well that had happened there. So I said, there must be a better way, and started interviewing different companies and just seeing like what was out there, who was doing something, and realized, okay, like this is a bigger problem than just Hotjars, and decided to give it a go.
So what were some of the things you found when you interviewed other companies? What were their sort of sharing knowledge challenges?
Yeah. So it was all pretty much the same. Like I heard like the continuous pattern that it got frustrating at some point. So everybody decided, okay, we needed to centralize it. They all decided, let's use like Notion or Confluence or Airtable. It all ended up breaking because people had to break out of the natural workflow to go and save things. Most of the time, only person that saved something they knew it existed. It's very difficult to keep fresh and up to date in these places because they're not purpose built. So all the same problems ended up occurring, but all the same solutions were being repeated to the problem. That was when I said, okay, like there's a better way we can rethink how we approach the problem. And I interviewed a lot of different companies, and it was always pretty much like the same thing over and over again.
And what were the roles inside the companies that you were talking to?
Marketing, product design, user research. I spoke to customer success. I spoke to everyone within the organization, but predominantly focused in like product teams was where I saw the biggest value for the product or service.
How long ago was it when you did this research?
2 years ago now.
Cool. And what's happened since then?
What's happened since then? So we actually ended up launching the first version of the product in September last year, I think about there. And we had really good initial interest and traction. So we had around 500 to 700 signups in the first month. We had companies like Adidas and InVision set up accounts with us. And then activation and usage was absolute shit. Nobody used the product.
It's hard, right?
Yeah, we like really tried to scratch our heads trying to understand like what went wrong. We did a lot of research, and I think in retrospect there was a couple of things. Is one, we tried in the beginning just to be more of an aggregator where you could bring from different sources. But one of the biggest learnings was that for knowledge sharing and for centralize it, like creating a repository to share research, is that I have a quote from one customer that's stuck in the back of my head, is that whoever has my attention for analysis is going to have my attention for the distribution. And people had an expectation to be able to store and synthesize user research, like user interviews from a repository. So that was a big key feature. And the second thing I think we made a mistake on was our first version of the product. We tried to change user behavior too much from what they were used to. And I think changing behavior is incredibly difficult. And it's something that needs to be done over time, like through education and activation. And we didn't do that justice, I think, to begin with, of like how we went about it, because our original product revolved a lot around a browser extension, which it still does today. But that wasn't a familiar way of collecting and storing and sharing knowledge within an organization. It required, I think, like a lot more of an onboarding handheld experience than we gave it in the beginning. So yeah, we hit the drawing board again. We reworked the product. We relaunched in May. And then since then, we've been seeing like really great retention, engagements. Like this month, last month, we had close to 1,000 signups for the product. We launched our paid plans. We're converting it 2 to 4% from free to paid, depending on the cohort now. The engine's starting to work, and we're starting to focus on some of the more interesting and fun challenges now of growing the business.
That's exciting.
It is.
Yeah. How did you come to understand this challenge with using the browser extension?
How we understood was that nobody used it.
But how did you figure out that was what was the problem?
just use interviews. So like we had a lot of signups, like I mentioned, 500 or 700 signups in that month, and literally just try to speak to everyone that would be willing to speak to us to try to understand going through it. So the only way, I think, like I said, in the early stage is really speaking to customers and trying to gather that from them. And we were lucky that we were able to speak to a lot and get to that point.
Yeah. So did you just like email people and invite them to set up a time, or?
Yeah. Email, we had to incentivize. I think that's unfortunate, but it's a necessary evil. I think when you're trying to recruit as well, if you want to get to any certain level of volume. So we incentivized, I think at the time we did $25 gift voucher, Amazon gift voucher was the thing. And yeah.
Yeah. Were you doing that research yourself as the founder, or did you have any UX research experts, or what did that look like?
Doing it myself as a founder. I think it's really important. But ultimately what we did try to do is get the whole team actually doing it at some point. So everybody was interviewing different perspectives, because I think also founders generally also have their own internal biases and like wanting to make sure that it wasn't like getting lost in your own internal biases. So having others on the team is really critical to be able to bring different perspective to it and different understanding.
Yeah, I think having several people involved in research really adds to the value of that research, because you get the different perspectives, and two people can sit in the same conversation and come away with different takeaways from it.
Exactly.
Was there anything that you found during that stage that was surprising to you, where you came away from a conversation and said, wow, I really needed to hear that, I didn't know?
I think the one aspect that was surprising was the quote that I mentioned. And like I said, because that's literally, it's been burnt in the back of my head since then. And because I think there was like, after all the initial research and interviews that I had been doing, like I'd never really heard something like this before, because I was really focused on the problem of distribution and how people were getting access to it and seeing it, and less around what was the content that was going to be stored inside it and what would be the use cases for the content, which in retrospect was a very big mistake. But yeah, so I think that was definitely like one of those moments, and then just being able to dig into that a lot more and realizing, okay, this is probably the biggest issue that we have today with the product, is we need to solve for this.
And if I can get meta for a moment, did you use your own tool to share the learnings from your own research?
Yes, of course.
And what was that like?
That's obviously always a really good learning experience, because as you're going through it, you're realizing a lot of pain points and like what needs to be fixed, and you're like, come on, this can't be right. So I think that's definitely like a big aid and a big help, is always, if you can, using your own product or service, like use it as much as possible. So for us, like we also in the early days, like just really tried to think what else could we put in that maybe wasn't a good use case for our product, but would get more of the team using it so they could also feel the pain points going through different aspects. So definitely helped bring polish to the product and to solve some of the more irritating little aspects of it as you're going through it.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's really great when you're building a tool that is useful for your own team so that you can dog food it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what does the team look like today?
So we're 6 people today, engineering, data science predominantly, and we're going to start to look to hire over the next couple of months to grow the marketing team. We're going to start a marketing team, so we'll hire our first person in marketing, and we also continue to grow our engineering team as well, hiring a product designer at the same time.
Awesome. And are you based in Cyprus? Are you remote? What does that look like?
Fully remote business. So companies based out of Cyprus, but like following in Hotjar's footsteps, I think we definitely want to be building a fully remote business. Hiring at the moment, mostly in Europe and Middle East time zones. Just something like learned, I think, at Hotjar and learned the hard way, is that even though you want to work and create a distributed workforce, I think if you don't have a good number and a good concentration in a specific demographic, it's very difficult, I think, to work across different time zones.
Yeah, I hear that. Definitely. I've worked with some clients that had a really broad distribution of time zones, and man, did it take a toll on the workers to try to coordinate with each other across that.
Yeah. And I think like at Hotjar, obviously it got to a certain size and scale where it was inevitable and necessary. But then it was really like what specific team. So it was like a sales team needed to be in the US because that's where they were servicing the customers. But that's pretty independent on its own. Like you can have a sales team operating in a specific region that doesn't need to necessarily always be communicating with the rest of the team. But a product team where you're working on a day-to-day basis with other engineers, I think that's a lot more challenging. And that's something where you need to be in similar time zones to be able to operate effectively.
Yeah. And are you at the scale yet where you're able to apply some of this retention analysis work that you've done previously to your own company?
Yep, we're definitely getting there now. And I think that's also like a good thing as well. Like we set up a really good data stack from the start.
What does it look like?
I'm a big fan of segment. I know like a lot of data engineers, but the thing I love about segments is essentially it allows you to have less data engineers to start. I think that's probably why they don't like it as much, and allowed us to then get different tools and services up and running faster, and also makes your switching costs like almost zero. So if we want to change a different product to service, we can replay data into it. So we use segments for all our data collection. On top of segment, we're using Mixpanel for data analytics. We set up Amplitude as well, but I find personally that it's a little bit more user-friendly for the majority of the team, whereas maybe Amplitude should get a little bit more geeky, but it's not as intuitive for everybody in the team. And what we really want is like everyone on our team to be able to understand, read data, and use it. And we're using then as well Redshift for our data warehouse. We haven't layered on top any BI tool yet. It hasn't been necessary, but most likely we'll either look into Tableau or Looker. Probably lean towards Looker this time around. We had Tableau at Hotjar, but I think at the time I was like a little bit more of a fan of Looker and what they were doing there. So that's pretty much the stack. And then we have other peripheral tools. So we use Hotjar obviously for certain analysis that we're doing, for surveys as well, and Intercom for other aspects. And we obviously all of these tools share data between each other. We can do some retention analysis and look at different activity that's happening across the different products and services as well.
Yeah. So have you started to find any ideal customer profile details for Avrio?
Yeah. So I think like we started in the beginning with this ideal customer profile in mind, just because we had done a lot of research in the beginning and we understood like who had this pain point, who had this problem the most. What we're starting to notice is there's different segments that we didn't expect to be using our product or service. So that's been interesting. And what we're doing now with that is just really, okay, the data is showing us one thing, we don't understand it. So we know what's happening, we don't know why. So now we're diving into user interviews and really just trying to pick some learnings out from there. But yeah, I mean, our ideal customer profile is fairly close to what we envisioned from the start. And it's what we researched at the start and is what we still see today. So those companies that are mid-market, product teams, they tend to be like really good active users, retained. So in most cases, we definitely see weekly usage and a lot of them daily usage of the product. So that's where our focus still lies. But like I say, we are seeing like interesting different segments that we didn't expect. So we see like journalists using the product to research articles, or students using our service to research for their master's thesis or putting together a dissertation. So these are segments.
Oh, those are some interesting use cases.
Yeah, interesting, but it's not something that we had envisioned or built a product for or have a good understanding of ourselves. So that's why we're busy leaning into that, just trying to understand like a little bit, is there maybe an opportunity?
Yeah. One question that came to mind while I was hearing you say some of that is, do you have a North Star metric that you've picked for how you're guiding your product team decisions?
Yeah. So for us, like we're focused mostly on weekly active viewers. As a metric that we've picked, we decided that, okay, if you're doing research and it's being shared effectively, the end goal is that people actually see the research. Essentially, what we track is anytime somebody views either a highlight or a report that's generated within Avrio, we count them as active within that period. And they obviously need to as well have been signed up more than a week ago. So we want to remove any bias from acquisition playing a role and so forth. So weekly active viewers is our North Star metric. And then we cascade back from there and we understand whether there are certain activities and that need to take place in order to get there from activation perspective. And these are the things we're working on now at the moment, is really like improving onboarding and activation for the different areas of the product.
Yeah, cool. It sounds like things are all following a good process and growing well, and you're in an exciting stage of the startup life.
Yeah, I think it's an exciting stage. Like I gave this analogy as well to a friend the other day. It's like, it feels like at this point is that we've been like struggling for like the last year and a bit. It's like we've just now managed to get to the top of the wall and we can see over the other side, and it's like balancing on the top now. It's either going to go like forward and like things are going to go extremely well, or you got to get prepared for that next downhill that's going to come inevitably in every startup. Like the ups and downs are always there. But at the moment, it feels like we're really on a good track and things are moving in the right direction.
Yeah. And what has the role of pricing and packaging been for the stage that you're at?
Yeah. So we did a bit of initial early research as well on pricing and packaging, just to understand the market and where things were at. I think this is something for us that we haven't quite figured out yet, and we need to do a better job of. I think one of the things looking at the business currently today is around like 6 to 8 months ago, before shit hit the fan everywhere, I said to our investors, I was like, it doesn't look like things are going great in the world, even though valuations are at their all-time high and everything is great. So I think as a business, maybe we need to start focusing on monetization a little bit earlier and trying to generate revenue instead of focusing on engagement and retention and growing virality. And I think this is maybe something that was good in the sense that, okay, now we're in a slightly better position that when we try to go fundraise, that we actually have got revenue, can start to show like growth. But at the same time, I've definitely seen like it's impacted the engagement and retention of the product from that perspective. And this is all to do with pricing and packaging, like the way that we restrict users at certain levels. So I think for us, like we're definitely going to be iterating, experimenting a lot with the pricing and packaging, which is one is like, how do we enable a freemium product that's powerful enough that enables anybody to continue using the service without any roadblocks, and then focusing more on what are the certain features that we can drive for upsell and what are those features that are more predominant from our ideal customer profile that we'll see as a good fit. And then perhaps like the students themselves, like we see them as more as a long-term growth play where they might use us for their dissertation and then they end up joining a company, and because they love our software and they're familiar with it, they would be the champions then to bring it in. This is something that we're going to be looking into over the next few months just to see, okay, how can we experiment with this to get a good medium where we get some good virality out of the freemium version product, but then we still have good checks in place for conversion for those that should be paying us and those that are within our ideal customer profile.
Yeah, that's interesting. I like the long-term play perspective on the students.
It's nice to have it if you have the luxury, but I think that's also in the early days, like you need as well to start generating those proof points and generating revenue. But definitely, I think there's a lot of good examples of companies that have taken this approach with students. And then like Qualtrics, I think, spoken about this. See, was their early customer adoption and base was predominantly students. And that's actually what made them into the business they are today, because they ultimately ended up taking them into the companies where they went to get jobs later.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think we're almost out of time, so I want to ask, where can people find you if they want to follow you?
Yeah, so for myself, like on LinkedIn, always active there, Twitter as well. If you want to check out Avrio, it's avrio.com. We have a freemium plan and you can get started and check things out for yourself there. But obviously, always love to chat about these topics. So if anybody wants to follow up, I'm always happy to just jump on a call or have a chat over LinkedIn or Twitter.
Wonderful. Awesome. Thank you so much, Andrew. It's been a pleasure talking to you today.
Thank you, Holly. It's been great.
The Product Science Podcast is brought to you by H2R Product Science. We teach startup founders and product leaders how to use the product science method to discover the strongest product opportunities and lay the foundations for high-growth products, teams, and businesses. Learn more at h2rproductscience.com. Enjoying this episode? Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss next week's episode. I also encourage you to visit us at productsciencepodcast.com to sign up for more information and resources from me and our guests. If you like the show, a rating and review would be greatly appreciated. Thank you.